Hi.
Hi. So, welcome to the third Complexity Matters live stream. Well, Matti is not here. He had some very important business to do. He and his wife have a new son. And of course, with the COVID and daycare closures, it's a bit of a busy schedule. So, we'll have to do it with us. And of course, we have a very special guest who will talk about very interesting complexity-related matters. But first, let's talk about the news. Do you have some news, Merlijn?
Yeah, I saw this new preprint. I'll share it.
Yes.
Is that working?
I don't know. I'm not seeing anything.
Oh, it's not working.
It's not working. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, now I see something. Okay. Here we go.
Yeah, I saw this new preprint by Damien Kelty Stefan and colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
It's on postural sway. So there are lots of there's lots of complexity-inspired research on postural sway, of course. So we also know that in people with types of movement disorders like Parkinson's disease, that the complexity of this sway is reduced. But there's also other research also done on walking in elderly people, and there the standard and higher standard deviation in the postural sway turn out to be bad or predictive of falling and stuff like that. So there's really a puzzling thing going on, because the standard deviation and this complexity indicators, they often correlate quite high. And here they did a really clever experiment in which they look at the standard deviation of the postural sway and the complexity in terms of multifractal fluctuations in a time varying way. And then you can see that actually the fluctuations, the multifractal fluctuations, seem to stabilize the postural sway in terms of standard deviation. So this gives a whole new perspective on this problem, and I think it's really really interesting.
Okay, so you mean there's a time varying measure of the fluctuation? Was that what you were saying?
Yeah, both.
Yeah, okay.
So there's a lot of research that just aggregates the standard deviation of the postural sway over time, or the complexity in terms of scaling. But here they look at both in time varying manner and then manipulate stability by changing the perceptual environment.
Oh, okay.
And then you get all kinds of new insights in how these things vary over time, which also helps to eliminate the relation between standard deviation and multifractal fluctuations.
Okay. Very interesting. Yeah. So I have been planning new guests, and Damien is one of the people on the list, I think. So maybe if he says yes, we can soon ask him about this. Very interesting. Let's see. We have. I had some news, of course. I talked about this already last time near the end of the stream. So our summer school that we teaching last year, it was not possible to give it, but now I've changed it to be completely online. And if you are interested in learning all about complexity methods for behavioral science, and you are quick, so before March the 1st, you get a good discount. So, and we've, by the way, because it's all online, we've had made a huge discount. But it's the complete course. All the topics that we would cover if it was in real life, we are going to cover as well online. And so while I was looking at these things, I also came across a paper, and I don't want to talk a lot about what they actually say in this paper, but this should get some kind of prize for the title, I think.
Yeah.
So we have transition-based complexity entropy causality diagram. I mean, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. So it's a novel method to characterize complex systems. I don't know if you are familiar with this type of fields in which people are trying to characterize different types of complex systems using some kind of measure or quantification. So you get a lot of these novel methods to characterize complex systems. But this one must be it, because this is a beautiful title.
Yeah, the title is really exciting, but I can't imagine what it would be like.
Yeah. Well, they promise to. Yeah, I've only skimmed it a little bit, but they have a particular way of classifying these systems, and apparently, their method works very well for artificial as well as real world systems. So yeah, you can check it out if you want to, but it's pretty technical stuff. Okay, so yeah, that's what I wanted to say. So I guess it is time to introduce our guest, and all the way from Las Vegas, right? We have Gwen. Hello, Gwen.
Hi. Can I stop sharing? Sorry. Hello.
No, you don't. No, it's perfectly fine. So how are you all the way on the other side of the world? It's very early for you.
It is. This is, as I was saying when we first got on, this is my earliest use of my voice this morning. So you're going to get a little bit of the shaky, just waking up voices. But I'm great. It's a beautiful sunny day. So
Yeah, we just lost the snow here, so here it's really winter.
I know. I'm watching that all over the country and all over the world, and I'm like, this is the good time to live in Las Vegas, because we're quite warm right now.
I've been there once, in Las Vegas. Very interesting.
That's a nice way to say it.
It was the starting point and the end point of a round trip around all the parks, like Zion, and of course the canyons, and so I didn't actually stay very long, which is a good idea.
Yeah,
but it was.
It's different when you live here, for sure, but it's a beautiful world. Those parks are gorgeous.
Yeah. Yes, I have lots of fond memories of the parks, as well as Vegas. Okay, so maybe you can tell a little bit about yourself, about your history, how you came to study complex systems.
Sure. So I'm an associate dean for research, and I've been in this field for a while, in the field of educational psychology. When I was working on my doctoral studies, I actually was in a interdisciplinary program for systems science. And at the time, I don't think I fully appreciated what was available to me. And so when I came out of that program, I think I had a really good conceptual grounding of a range of different concepts that were underlying systems, but I didn't get a chance to practice that much. And I went into a pretty traditional space in the university. And it's only been probably the last 5 or 6 years that I've been able to kind of re-engage in the way that I would like with the community and complex systems, largely because I study social systems and I study embedded environments with classrooms and learning processes. And in our field in education, there's a lot of talk around theoretical theory that has complex ideas, but not much in terms of design and analyses that would allow us to study systems as complex systems. So happenstance, met a colleague that Jon Hilpert, and he and I have been working together for years on method and trying to talk with our colleagues. And we've got a really nice small core community in education and psych that are really interested in trying to think about how we can apply, design our studies in different ways and apply methods that would allow us to really understand the system as complex. So that's kind of where I'm at, which is really, so my focus has been more on the design and method right now, but so that's kind of where I'm at in terms of history.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned this last time when we announced that we would be talking to you. Yeah, I think it's very important because it's kind of an obvious field to apply all these theoretical concepts, but then of course in the end you need to be doing studies as well, and so I don't think a lot of people are doing that right now, or am I wrong about that?
No, you're right. It's definitely an emerging space in education,
yeah.
And there's a lot of overlap with psychology. We suffer, and that's actually one of the things I'm going to talk about today. We suffer from this data problem, right? And that we don't have access usually to really dense data that allows us to model dynamic patterns in time series, and like reoccurrence analysis, for example, would be great, but we often just don't have the data to be able to look at dynamic processes. So one of the things, and it is really difficult for researchers to get into classrooms and be able to collect those types of data. So we have to think about what we can learn with the methods that we have available, and then also how can we repurpose some of the data that we get through click streams. For example, I've got Jon was just showing me some really cool work that he's doing with Jeff Green and Matt Bernanke out in North Carolina, where they're looking at clickstream data as indicators of behavioral engagement patterns in online learning, and using some Markov models to create networks to take the behavior within classrooms, turn them into networks, and then use them to think about how navigation within courses influences how people actually their learning outcomes in those spaces. So we have some data available, but it's definitely an emerging area. So I think learning from researchers in fields like behavioral science and psychology and other areas that have been really engaged in using these methods for a longer period of time is helpful for us. Natural sciences are great, but having that, we have these social group dynamics, and we have individual dynamics, and trying to understand something about that complexity is a challenge, and we have a lot to learn. So
yes, okay, well, I'm very interested in what you have to tell us. So let me add your screen here.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's a nice Droste effect. Excuse me. Sorry. I think we went into a little echo there, but that's okay. And I'll remove ourselves, so you can just start talking, and then we can enjoy your presentation.
Well, break in whenever something comes up, because I can't see any of your beautiful faces. So I'm just going to actually talk about and go kind of at a really 45,000 foot level about some of the work that we've been doing to try to deal with some of those issues related to the number of time points that we have available for us with data. And specifically, I'm going to focus on thinking about some of the work we've been doing with engagement and motivation, which is important for factors that influence how people learn. So excuse me, I definitely have a frog in my throat this morning. All right, so I'm really fortunate, and I have to say, and I want to acknowledge some of the incredible collaborators that I've worked with over the years, because I'm presenting the work that has come from all of us. And in particular, I'll be talking about several examples. So I'm not going to present a specific paper. I just am going to highlight a couple different examples that might be interesting. So Chandler Hilly, David McKinney, and Rachel Part are all early career scholars that led the different projects that I'll be showing you some examples from today. And they were really gracious to let me do that on their behalf. So I'm excited about that. And so one of the things that we run into in education and educational psychology in particular is that we have these rich theories about that include elements of dynamics, macro level behavior and emergent properties. We have difficult time sometimes reducing what we see in learning situations down to lower levels, but then we turn those into these component dominant, very linear conceptual models that then really kind of model out the complexity of our processes. And so we tend to lose that. So Jon and I wrote a paper about that a couple of years ago, and we've really been trying to think about ways that we can look at our dynamic processes and really focus on the interdependence that we see in our education systems in an authentic way, even if we don't have access to some of the really dense time series data that would be ideal for doing that. So just kind of briefly, the focus that we have is that our classroom system is a network. We have individuals that are systems that are operating within these systems that are also have complex and dynamic behavior. So we are thinking about how can we discern these patterns of interdependence within educational systems. So the example I'm bringing is engagement. For those of you not familiar with the concept, it's the idea that it's our manifestation of a motivational state. So however you're feeling, it's going to manifest in the quality of your mental effort, which is cognitive engagement, your physical behavior patterns, which is behavioral engagement, and the way that you feel when you're participating in learning tasks, which is emotional engagement. Most of the time we collect data through self-report and other report, although there is some observations that we use, but even so, even if we're using experience sampling methods, oftentimes we might have 10 to 20 observations from real classrooms or real people, which kind of puts us in that data no man's land of what do we do with this and thinking about our dynamics. Okay, so for those of you that aren't familiar with them, we use state-space grids, which is a representation not of from a dynamic systems perspective. Like I said, we're not really able sometimes with our data to use dynamical approaches, but state-space grids are a visual representation of two time series data. So most of the time in education, we look at social partners. So for example, teacher and student interaction. So Pennings and Hollenstein have a nice example of this in a special issue we edited on Journal of Educational Experimental Education on complex systems in education. And then also Turner and Christensen have a new one. But the idea is that this is an example from Hollenstein and Lewis. We can identify patterns of repeated activity across the entire possible space, which can help us understand if there are potential attractors around that interaction. And we use gridware for those representations. Okay, so a couple of years ago, Chandler led this project where we were looking at this time series of engagement. This is kind of typical data in education where we have maybe 100, 125, 130 students. We're using self-report survey items embedded in a learning system. And we find these self-reports that have pretty significant variability. On the left is an engagement time series, on the right is engagement or self-efficacy, which is the idea of, do I feel capable of participating in whatever task that I'm doing? And when we assume that there's some sort of interdependence amongst this motivational variable and the engagement variable, but we don't really have a way to model it. And over 12 time points, our traditional general linear models that we use in EdPsych have a tendency to not model that interdependence effectively. And so most of the time people aggregate and they just look for the amount of variance that's predicted over time in an outcome, which isn't the same as understanding how these go together. So we just pulled out a couple and we actually looked at two variables together, and the green kids are kids that scored poorly on a pretest in math, and the blue kids are the kids that scored the 5 highest in math. And we just wanted to see if there were potential differences with how they were moving across the psychological space. And for the green kids, for us, it was interesting to note that the dispersion was higher, so they were moving more across the space. And then also the blue, the children that are performing better are more likely to kind of exist in what we would find as the theoretical ideas around engagement and motivation. So highly engaged kids are more likely to spend time in a highly motivated state, whereas kids that aren't performing as well are much less coherent and congruent in that relationship. So we took that as kind of a proof of concept, and David McKinney led another study where we had 1,800 end of class reports, which is kind of like an experience sampling methodology. We had about 10.8 per student. And we aggregated these trajectories over time at the sample level, so across the whole sample, the classroom, the lesson, and the individual. And we created state spaces for those different levels because we do have multi-level systems, and we're really interested in understanding what we can learn if we treat data at these different levels instead of just assuming that the full sample tells us everything we need to know about what's happening. So just kind of briefly, the full sample, the data that you see there, we have kids. So we've got, for all of these, I have two variables. One is cognitive engagement, so the quality of your mental effort. The other is your behavioral engagement. These are Likert scale data. So the upper right quadrant is kind of the highly engaged in both spaces. When we look at the full sample, we see that, there's a lot of kids that are spending time in sort of this more highly engaged state, but we also see some patterns that are make a little bit less sense from theory. So we have highly behaviorally engaged, but not necessarily exerting a lot of mental effort, and vice versa. So when we took that apart in classrooms, we had 6 teachers involved with this. We see different patterns. So in class A1, we have kids that are more congruent in their behavior. And when we have class 2, we have kids that are kind of in a much greater use of the state space. And even within that, we can look down at the lesson A and lesson B from class C, and we see that on different days, people are engaged. These two variables are overlapping in really different ways. And that helps us understand when we look at much like Travis was saying last time, we have to look at the qualitative data or other types of data to be able to understand some of these patterns. And what we see is that in class A1, we have a teacher that uses a lot of interactive and very supportive, motivationally supportive practices. In class 2, this is a little bit more of a traditional lecture type of class. And then even within that lesson, when that class uses labs and other types of interactive processes, there's more congruence between the behavioral and cognitive engagement. And so then we pulled them out and looked at the individual level, and we identified students, 5 students with the largest standard deviation in behavioral engagement and the students with the smallest standard deviation in behavioral engagement. And again, we see really different patterns and uses of space, which helps us understand something about potentially how to intervene and where there might be transition points, depending on lessons, that might mean that students are more open to some intervention to help shift their motivational state and consequently their engagement. So we kind of take these state space grids, and then we also have been looking at network visualizations to capture some of the social dynamics. So what I just showed you is this within-person type of dynamic. But then we're also interested in how individuals are functioning within these broader social states. So we use network analyses pretty often, and we've used it for a range of different types of educational and also team research, team science processes. And we are able to use these to help us understand how people are forming relationships and how information is flowing through learning systems. So this is Rachel Part's work. She led this, and she did a great job looking at the way naturally occurring study groups form in undergraduate learning classes and the relationship that personal motivational factors had on the propensity to form a tie in those classrooms. And so she was interested in kind of who do I study with. Traditionally in education, that would be like a pre-post type of survey that would be analyzed with regression or something like that. She turned that into a network, found a couple interesting things. There's a lot of isolates, right? So we don't see a lot of kids that are actually naturally forming steady ties, which is interesting information for us. And we also found a slight increase in transitivity, so people kind of consistently forming close triangles. But this is an unfortunate thing in biology for this particular sample, but most of the people that were isolates tended to be female and also tended to be first generation college students. So that helps us understand something too about the way that people are being welcomed into a classroom system, and then also the extent to which people are being viewed potentially as good study partners. Okay. So this particular, when we look at the change, Rachel looked at, she used some Sturgeon models to look at the changes over time in the formation and dissolution of ties, and actually found that kids, for example, I'm not going to scoop Rachel because she's writing this paper, but first generation college student status kids were less likely to form ties, but people that share perceptions of psychological costs of studying as stressful are more likely to hold a tie, and that there's different patterns related to your personal motivation in terms of who you seek out ties with and when ties are forming and dissolving. So these are just a couple ways that we're trying to use and methods that allow us to begin to try to understand and unpack some of the complex dynamic processes in education when we don't necessarily have that dense time series data to be able to look at the dynamics in a different way. And I think that for us, there's implications for method and theory and practice that I hope are helpful for people in other spaces as well. And so I don't know if there's discussion. I'm just kind of moving through because I can't see anything on the other side. And I just want to thank you all for inviting me to come and have this conversation with you. It's a lot of fun for me to be able to learn from everyone. And that's it for me. So if there's, can't see you or here. I feel like I'm in a box. So.
Oh, Fred, you seem muted.
Oh, I was talking, but nobody heard me.
I wonder, I feel like I'm alone at the other end.
I said, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
You're welcome.
And it's okay to close your PowerPoint now. So
okay,
you can,
great.
Yeah.
So I can actually participate.
Yeah, I will remove it. So,
great.
Thank you. Well, that's very interesting. Interesting research, and sort of confirms that I've not really seen these techniques applied in this context a lot, I think. So yeah, let's see if there are people in the chat. There were quite a few people watching. If they have any questions, not yet, I think, but they will pop up. We have like a 30-second delay, so that takes some time.
I'm really amazed by these multi-level state space grids. I never saw that, but it's such a great idea to do it in a way like this.
Yeah. So is this something which is? Why are you calling it multi-level, Marlene? Because of the different. Yeah.
Yeah, you take different levels of the system, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a neat idea.
But it's not multi-level in the sense that we're looking at, so multi-level in the sense that we would be looking at state space grids from like the teacher-student interactions and then looking within. Although we do have that for this particular data where we have teacher perceptions of student engagement and student perceptions of student engagement. And we look to see that the way that those interact, but it's more just taking slices. So I probably want to be careful with the way that I say that, but it's more, kind of taking different slices of the data and looking at it to think about how we can learn different things if we disaggregate it in different ways. And I think for us, that's important because we have a tendency to really aggregate at the level of the sample and assume that we're learning everything that there is to know. And oftentimes we obscure some of the processes that are really probably important for thinking about interventions in educational spaces. So I think it's an interesting way to look at it. But
no, absolutely. So the software, the state space grid software, maybe I can share this
Yeah.
So this is the gridware. I think it's for all operating systems, or at least Windows as well as Mac, right? Yeah. Or is it just Mac? No, Windows and Mac.
No, you can do both.
Yeah. So I talked to Tom some time ago about making an R version of the state space grids. But I haven't gotten around to it, to completing it yet. But no, it's a very intuitive method, I think, for studying especially behavioral type data, like observations. So, but in your case, is that the case for you? Yeah, I guess so. And of course, it also allows to do some things with continuous data, but I guess there are perhaps other techniques like recurrence analysis that would probably be more appropriate. But it's a very intuitive method, I think, and also it can be very powerful in discovering these temporal patterns. And of course, you can apply all the complexity lingo, like state spaces, attractors, all those kinds of things to your data, which is of course very, very interesting. Have you worked with Tom, by the way, or is it?
I haven't. I haven't had an opportunity to meet with him or meet.
Okay.
Just use this, but I'd be curious too, because we are using it a little bit differently than I've seen it be used in terms of the psychological dimensions.
Yeah.
Some of the constructs and the way that they vary together, as opposed to thinking about the way that behaviors vary together for different partners. But we've also used some graphical models to look at the way that variables feed into each other, instead of just looking at the networks in terms of actors as persons. We looked at basically nodes as variables. And so I think one of the things that we suffer from the same replication crisis that you write about in psychology, and that we typically have very small effects. And then we also have situations that are so highly contextualized, it's really difficult to find those effects in these systems where you can't track down, you can't understand the way that the dependence within the systems manifest in some sort of outcome. So, using mixed methods and other techniques, might be a good way for us to gain some understanding, even if it doesn't help us necessarily generalize a finding. We can look to see if there's consistent patterns.
Well, this is of course one of the things of idiographic science, right? So you can consider a school or even a classroom as an entity that is probably very highly contextualized. The things that are going on there might be very different from what's going on in other schools, but then of course the point is taking the complex systems approach, is saying there are some general principles that we can discover based on looking at what's going on in the dynamics or the structure of the interactions, those kinds of things, the interactions between the components that might be universal, but the way it pans out, the way it specifically applies to this case might be very different. So in the meantime, we have indeed seen some questions popping up. And let's start with Travis. Hello, Travis. So he asks, thanks for the interesting talk, Gwen. Would you expect similar engagement patterns on the state space grids for university students and variation by topics?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Travis. It's an empirical question for us. And by the way, I really liked your talk last time. So I would expect, so theory would tell us that we would expect similar engagement patterns, but, I think it would vary quite a bit in terms of topic. So what we're interested in is what's happening in the classroom. So what's the instructional demand that might lead people to participate in sort of these more prototypical ways related to engagement. And I would think that, we expect, for example, science that is a much more interactive type of learning topic and different types of science, like physics compared to engineering, compared to chemistry, compared to biology, we might see differences in the way people are, the different inputs from the environment and demands of learning tasks might lead to different patterns. But yeah, I think the most interesting thing for us is that you can have people that appear very behaviorally engaged, but are not exerting a lot of mental effort into the topic, which is probably pretty consistent. I think in college, we might see the opposite, where we have people reporting a high degree of mental effort and cognitive engagement, but maybe lower on the behavioral engagement side, right? So they're kind of more absorbing and able to manipulate some of these ideas in their with respect to their previous knowledge in a different way than maybe an elementary or middle school student would. So.
Okay, well, Travis, we'll notice in the chat whether that answer your question. I think it does. So we have also a question, or this is first a comment by, this is our student from China. And he also has a question. I have a question about the state space grid method you used. What additional info do you think this method provides comparing with dot plot? I actually do not know what that is. Do you know, Marlijn?
Yeah, just a plot with dots.
Oh, okay, maybe
a correlation,
right.
like a correlation.
Okay.
Oh, more of a correlation matrix. You know, what I didn't show you is that this particular program does provide you some indicators around some descriptive indicators around you know, the entropy, what you're seeing in the system. And so there's more information that you get that's not just a visualization of a correlation matrix. And I also think it's really helpful because we get an idea of the way that people are moving through the system. So for example, that empty circle is where they start, right? And you can see how they move as opposed to a correlation matrix, which is just a dot plot. You just have the way that two variables for an entire sample come together. So I think that movement across the state space is what's probably most interesting for me, and looking to see if people are moving in similar ways. And then in terms of the data we're collecting, trying to understand what's happening in the environment at that time as a potential control parameter for that movement across the system. So I think there's information for sure that we gain using this type of grid as opposed to just plotting two variables together.
Yeah, I think especially the noting that there are regions or in this space that the system is attracted to, whatever you are observing, is something that's not always obvious from just looking at the data or calculating visitation times or something like that. So sometimes it just helps to look at it like this. The question might have a little bit of a background because Jingmeng is doing some very formal work on on recovering, let's say, attractor landscapes from models.
Yeah.
So, but that's a whole different field. And here this is really approaching from the other side where we just are looking at can we see these patterns and does it make sense to observe, to look at the dynamics in this way. But thank you, Jingmeng, for your question. And we have also James is asking us a question. Curious to hear how your colleagues in the education field are receiving this new approach. That's a great
question, James. I think it's a mixed bag. So I think that what's really interesting are our early career folks. So our doc students, early, assistant professors, people that are maybe a little trained in really traditional approaches and are finding some dissatisfaction with with that in terms of adequately capturing the nature of the phenomena that we're studying. So I do think that, you know, just like most places, we've got some of our older guard that are saying this is the way you do it, and that this isn't that cute. But there's also I think that there's a real thirst, and as people are exposed to more methods, they are trying them out. I do have to say too that, you know, we have a handbook that comes out every 10 years for our field, and Jon and I were invited to write a chapter on complex systems. So it's the first time that type of chapter has ever shown up in the handbook. So I think it's suggesting some momentum. And also there's that state-space grid paper. There's one of the state-space grid papers that I sent along by Turner and Christensen that showed up in our flagship journal just in the most recent piece. So I do think that people are beginning to get more accepting, and I'm excited to see as our field learns more about some of the different methods that are being used in natural sciences and psychology and behavioral sciences, how they apply them to what makes sense for them to be able to ask the kinds of questions that they want to be able to ask of their data.
It's this paper, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So, but this is a very common theme. I think we are right now, and when I say we, I mean, let's say behavioral science, but also clinical psychology is much more open to accepting these different methods and techniques. But that was a little bit of a fight. It hasn't always been that way. But it's good to see that more fields are now opening up to these ideas.
Yeah, and I want to say too about that, and I don't know, I'm curious to see what your field has said. Like this, I think networks and state-space grids are a little bit more intuitive. Yeah. So they're helpful for people to kind of, it's like an entry, you know, they can get it. Mm-hmm. And when we're looking at some of the methods that are used, dynamical methods that are used to apply it to this intensive time series data, we have not seen much of that yet. So I'm not entirely sure how that will be received. Yeah. And I'm curious about it. I think it's just going to take a lot of interpretation, translation on the behalf of the author in order to help the reviewers understand that that will.
Yes, it's for example, of course, Matti, who's now not here, he has sort of the same problem. So in the area of policy making, and this is also quite new. But some of the papers that we've now sent out do get very interesting reviews. So it's not the case that all the reviewers are saying away with this, but you do get the comment. Maybe you can explain this a little bit more easy. And do we really need to do this? But that's fine. I mean, there was a period of time where people just did not want to hear about this. For instance, in cognitive science. So things are changing, I guess, for the better. Let's see. Jingmeng is this a follow-up question? Let's see. I guess that should be related to the time information. Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Because in the grids we can see the trajectory instead of separate dots.
Yeah.
Yeah. Could you explain a little about how you use the time-related info?
I'm going to interpret that, and if I'm interpreting that question but not as intended, please let me know. But we use the time-related info as and to help us understand, for example, where students started out in their trajectory. I mean, I think it's kind of an interesting question, the whole initial condition question for educational data and psychological data, because it's really just where you start collecting data. It's not necessarily where you start, but you know, we were interested. We used it to try to see if there was any pattern that we could discern around, you know, for example, if you started out in a low behaviorally engaged state, were you more likely to move through the grid in a different way over time compared to maybe if you started off in a more congruent position between behavior and cognition. Are you more likely to kind of stay in that more tightly coupled space? And so we did use it that way. We also used it looking with some of the video data that we have around what was actually happening in the classroom when we see people that are more tightly clustered. So interestingly enough, there's the memory in these systems is a little bit interesting. So, there's so much that's task demand compared to maybe the propensity to participate in particular ways in school. And so we're able to use the time-related information to map that onto what's actually happening in the environment and see maybe the extent to which that acts as a little bit of a perturbation, right? So how do we get people into a more engaged state and keep them there more consistently? And that does have some time-related information. But in terms of being able to look at like the extent of autocorrelation in the system and how it moves forward, we really can't do that with this particular technique, but it does give us an idea of the way that the movement across the space is related to environmental changes and also maybe where people began for the academic year, for the unit.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So I was thinking. You mentioned video recordings. Of course, the video itself is, of course, something that you can think of as a time series, right? So you have these nice movement energy analysis. I don't know if you've heard about that. Motion energy, I think it's called. Which are very interesting. At least we use this to study like client-therapist interactions, but also just interactions between people with high social anxiety and low social anxiety. And it's a very interesting way to generate a time series that is. It's not really physiological. It's not really high-end recording of with infrared cameras or something like that, but it does give you some interesting data to look at.
Well, and I'm curious about that too, because I know that Pennings and Hollenstein, they used that joystick method where they coded interactions in their classrooms by kind of with this time series type of approach. We haven't gotten, this is a third year of a grant that was interrupted by COVID. So we haven't gotten we're just starting to get to the video data, but that's a really great idea. I'll look into that. We're not entirely sure what to do with that in terms of the time series element, that potential element.
Yeah. Well, one complication could be that you have, of course, a whole classroom of people who are moving, right? So well, it's something to think about, maybe. We have a question from Christine. Overall, what types of insight are you the most excited about using these new techniques in education research?
It's a great question. For me, I think I'm most excited. I come from a developmental psychology space. And so for me, I think drawing attention to the individual within that classroom system and the within-person change that we see and how the environment is constraining or affording those changes, I think is an exciting piece that we haven't seen, strangely enough, in education. It's such a learning. I just don't. I came to it from developmental psych, and it was like coming to another world. I didn't understand why there wasn't more longitudinal data collection, for example. So that's, I think, what's most exciting for me is really helping us understand that what we're educating and when we're learning, we have people that are learning and they learn in different ways and different patterns over time, and helping understand the way that that is an embedded process within the social environment and that there's multiple components to that environment. I think it's an exciting piece. Just trying to honor that.
Yeah, definitely. Yes. Yeah, you can have very different focuses in educational science, I've noticed. We also have a Department of Educational Science here, and actually some of them really do collect sort of time series data in the classroom, which is very interesting. But very often, then they go on and do kind of qualitative analyses on
Or
on those data.
I can't tell you how many times I've seen time series data aggregated. And I'm like,
yes, aggregated. Yeah,
why you would do that? Why would you do that? So, yeah.
But I think there was one study where they even had like because it was a study on adaptive learning, I guess. So all the kids had like a tablet, but they could monitor the position also, and the teacher also had a tablet, so they could monitor the position of the of the tablet basically, and then but of course, you need some time series analysis to be able to analyze if there are any patterns there.
Right. So average across the time series doesn't help us.
No.
Time series.
No. Good that you say that, because we have some students listening, and we always say this, of course, but now you hear it. You hear it from someone else. No, I think they believe what we say. Okay, so I see some very nice confirmations that you answered the questions. Nice, that is very promising. Yingman, even more clear now. Thanks again. And Christine says, super cool, thank you. Okay. So Marlijn, if you have any questions still. We didn't get into talking about the networks, but...
Oh, that's okay. It was kind of, I was trying to be fast. So
yeah.
Depth.
I'm still in the back of my mind and thinking about all these things and how they also apply to areas that we talked about previously, like in clinical psychology, for instance. Mm-hmm. So I really like this idea with the stage-based grid that you aggregate on different time scales. I think that's essentially what happens, right? So you take the whole period or a smaller period in which there's a specific context, like a lesson.
Yeah. You can, yeah.
I'm not at the point that I have a question about, but I'm just, I think it's a very interesting idea, and I think it also should apply to other kinds of situations where there are smaller dynamic patterns embedded in larger dynamic patterns.
I see the gears shifting, Marlijn.
Yeah.
No, but we'll
come back to it next episode.
Oh yeah, that's great. Okay, yeah, so we've been going on for over 50 minutes. So maybe it's a good time to close off this section. I just wanted to say about the networks is that, of course, we know a lot about, or we often see research about the social networks in classrooms, like primary education, where you have like the friendship networks and those kinds of things. But I was thinking, what you do not often see is that they make those networks dynamic. And I'm not sure if yours were dynamic in nature, but maybe they could be.
Yeah, I think they could be. We, there's the Siena models and things like that are used to try to model the formation and dissolution over time, which I think is really interesting. I think trying to collect data that allows us to look at, to have basically time series of network data, I think is something that I'd like to see a lot. John and I wrote a grant for that. We weren't funded, but that was one of our goals, was to be able to look over, a more extensive time period using sensors like the ones that Travis talked about last time, or even nomination data if we couldn't get that. What those networks look like over repeated measures in a learning situation. And, we are particularly interested in understanding the positionality of different individuals within those systems. So underrepresented folks in engineering and science, for example, like
right,
and how that their position changes, how information flows through them, and then the way that ties are formed and dissolved based off of some of the characteristics of either the learning situation or the individual. And trying to understand that in a more dynamic way, I think, is a promising method. We just, again, we have data problems. So trying to get those data without and getting access to those classrooms is also one thing too. Asking students to wear a sensor every time they walk into a classroom, you know, it takes some cooperation. So.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, it is. It is. So when we, of course, have a lot of client data, which is there's more of an intrinsic motivation to cooperate and you know, work with the intervention program, and also with let's say youth. You know, they're used to using apps and stuff like so there you have quite a large cooperation, but when you get to college students, it's already, you know, becoming a little less. And yeah, it is kind of an you're asking something, right? You're asking to have a little bit of a peek into your life, into your personal life, and some people are a little bit hesitant about that. No, that's that I can imagine that is some hurdle to to get to those types of data. I do know that such data sets exist, but they it's very often someone who like made a deal with like an ICT company and hands out like watches or tablets, and then as a and then collect data as a part of the deal, basically. Okay, so I see something popping up. This has been great for generating lots of ideas. Okay, that's great, Travis. For things I can study with my students from semester to semester.
There you go.
With their consent, yeah. Okay, well, that's a good note to end this section on. So we're going to, we have our section called Strange Attractors, and I had a beautiful theme song composed to introduce this section, but somehow YouTube thinks that it's, I don't know, it's too strange, I think. But it was cut out from the last live stream. I don't know why. But I'm just going to try again. Maybe this time. Maybe this time it will work. Yeah. Sounds great, isn't it?
It does.
I don't know why. On Twitter, we also were broadcasting to Twitter, and there it's still in the stream. But YouTube, I don't know. Maybe they thought
Twitter
this
is more strange.
Yeah, or I like to think I came up with a beautiful explanation. They think it's so professional. There must be a copyright on it, but they can't find it. So just to be safe. Yeah, terrible. So who has something they want to promote or talk about or mention?
I will mention something. I don't have anything, it's nothing fun out in the world in terms of popular culture, but there's a journal, a new journal in our field called the International Journal of Complexity in Education. That is just published its second iteration, and that's the editorial team for that.
Do you have it on your screen?
I do.
Okay. There we go. Yes.
Yep. And Matt Koopmans and Dimitrios Demoblasis are running that, and I've got a pretty good group there. So I am excited about this, and I hope anybody doing work in education would consider it as an outlet.
Yeah, that's important. That's a very important step to to start building a field, to have a journal that is really specifically for this topic. Yeah. Oh, great. I'm going to check it out.
Yeah, cool.
Very cool. You also mentioned a book, which I had somewhere. Where? Oh, here it is. Let me check if I can. Yeah. Complex Dynamical Systems in Education. So I was able to get this book just through our university's subscription. So I don't know if this is available for everyone, but it looks very interesting. Let me see. Oh, I have to scroll over here. Yeah, it's got a lot of interesting chapters, I think, on how to use complex systems in education. I see catastrophe modeling. Interestingly, I don't not see a lot of names I know, so that's great. Marijn van Dijk and Paul van Geert, of course, we do know them. Yeah. So I'm looking forward also to look at some of these chapters here, and I'll put the link or maybe the title in the chat or in the description later on. Did you also have a chapter here in this book, or?
No, I didn't.
No, okay.
No, but
okay. It's a little bit older already, from 2000.
It is. It's from 2016.
16. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. But I didn't know about it, so here we go. Marlijn,
I have something a bit strange.
We like strange.
I'll try to share it.
Just very briefly, James is asking me, yes, the 5-string you see, there.
I could come take some lessons from you, Fred. I just started trying to learn how to play the baritone ukulele.
Yeah, that's yeah. Well, then you should actually go to James, because he is a dare I say professional, James, ukulele player.
Oh, really? Yeah, I can't even figure out where to put my hands yet. So we're still.
Okay. Well, that's where you have to start. So.
Exactly.
Yes, Marlijn, do I share your screen? Probably.
Yeah.
Here we go. Aha.
All right.
What is this?
So I saw this beautiful picture a couple of times the last weeks, because we had really cold weather in the Netherlands, and we were predicting whether we could go ice skating, especially the famous 11-town skating race in Friesland, Elfstede, toch? And so these models were everywhere in the popular media, and there's such a nice depiction of sensitive dependence to initial conditions. So what you see here, for example, is the thickness of this is the temperature, I think. No, this is the ice. Yeah, the thickness of the ice. So here there's no ice, so I also don't think this prediction here makes much sense. But here it starts to predict ice of 5 centimeters. But you can see that this prediction is very unreliable, because these green lines are like the bands. So yeah, it's typical sensitive dependence to initial conditions. On the short term, you can predict the weather very well, and then it gets more and more unreliable over time. And I was just talking with my friend and colleague Freek Oude-Maatman about this, because there are also now all these formal models in psychology. And I think a realistic formal model in psychology should at least maybe have something like this. That it in the short term you may predict something, but it should get more unreliable over time. I think that's just realistic for the complexity of the system.
Yeah, well, it should be if it is, of course, a chaotic system. But yeah, no, I was very suspicious of these predictions, but well, they came true in the end, of course. So yeah, I except for the book, I also had like a recommendation. Maybe some of you already know it. I have to share my screen. Sorry. This is a YouTube channel called Number File. So people who love numbers. It's one of my favorite YouTube channels because they interview mathematicians about all kinds of things, and there is a lot of content here that's actually relevant if you're interested in complex systems. So you can see, let's see, where do you see some butterflies here? Of course, that's actually not, but they talk about the Mandelbrot set, about deterministic chaos a lot. Right, here we have Mandelbrot. They have nice demonstrations, also sometimes links to software and those kinds of things. But sometimes also psychological concepts. So Hannah Fry is especially doing that type of work. So this is about Weber's law. And sometimes it's very interesting to look at how mathematicians look at what psychologists think are laws. But especially this one, I can really recommend. Well, basically all the videos which feature him, Cliff Stoll is this. But I was looking at this again because we're just in the course about to explain about recurrence quantification analysis and phase-space reconstruction, which we talked about, I think, in the first episode a little bit. And one of the things about this phase-space reconstruction is that well, it says you just have to measure one dimension of a complex system, and based on this dimension, you can actually say something about the entire system. And but the guarantee of this method is that you have something called topological equivalence or homeomorphism. And if you want to know what that means and never forget it, you have to watch this video because he shows you what that actually means. So things can look very different. So if you reconstruct this attractor, it will not look exactly the same as if you would have a model built from or attractor built from a model. It will look different, but it retains all the properties of the original attractor. So that's actually what is in the theorem, and he shows this by creating various steps of an object, and then it in the end it becomes, I don't know exactly what it becomes. I think it becomes a mug or something. But once you've seen this, you know exactly what is meant by topological equivalence. So that's a recommend right there. Okay. Well, yeah, we are again at 1 hour and 10 minutes. So I'd like to thank our guest, Gwen, for doing the presentation. Very interesting, and I would say keep on exploring this road. And if you need any, I don't know, help or information, don't hesitate to contact us. Because I think it's like I said already when we announced you, I think it's important for educational science also to start looking at these methods and techniques that we are using now quite frequently, actually. But also theoretically, I think there's just so many things to the educational system, but also schools and individuals can benefit from taking this complex systems approach. So yeah, excited to learn more about what you'll be doing in the future. And do you want to say anything? Maybe I don't know. Closing off.
I just want to say thank you.
Okay.
It was super interesting. And I'll keep on thinking about the space-based grids and
we'll get back to that. Yeah.
It gets there. No, thank you.
Okay.
And thanks for inviting us to be a part of the conversation too. I appreciate it.
Great to have you. And well, if this continues, I don't know, maybe next year we can have a checkup on how you are doing. Okay. So thank you, chat, for being here and asking those very good questions. And the next session, the next episode does not yet have a date, but we do have several people who could be our guests. So that's going very well. It will be somewhere a couple of weeks, 3 or 4 weeks. But we'll let you know. If you subscribe to the channel on YouTube, you will be reminded when we schedule the next live stream. So I see all the YouTubers say, hit that like button, right? Hit subscribe and the notifications bell. That's what you have to press in order to be notified. Okay, thank you all, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye.